What could this old locksmith possibly know about sophisticated security systems? That's what the heist leader told his crew as they planned to rob First National Bank of Cedar Falls. He's just a small-town locksmith, he laughed, pointing across the street at Miller's Lock and Key. But Frank Miller was watching them from his shop window. And as someone who had spent 20 years defusing IEDs and understanding every type of explosive device imaginable, he had already spotted the fatal flaw in these amateurs' plan. Welcome to Echo Stories. Before we dive into this incredible tale of hidden expertise and small-town heroism, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like these deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button, because the most extraordinary people often hide in the most ordinary places. You see, what these would-be bank robbers didn't know was that Frank Miller wasn't just any locksmith. For 2 decades, he had been one of the Army's most skilled explosive ordnance disposal specialists. He had defused bombs in Iraq, dismantled IEDs in Afghanistan, and designed security systems that were considered impossible to crack. And now, in the quiet town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, those skills were about to save the day in ways no one could imagine. Cedar Falls, Iowa, population 39,000, nestled in the heart of America's Midwest. It was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody, where the biggest excitement was usually the Friday night high school football game, and where crime consisted mostly of teenagers toilet papering houses on Halloween. Frank Miller had lived there for 25 years, ever since he retired from the Army in 1999. His small shop, Miller's Lock and Key, sat on Main Street between Peterson's Hardware and Mabel's Diner. The faded blue sign had been there so long it was practically part of the town's landscape. At 68 years old, Frank was exactly what you'd expect from a small-town locksmith. Gray hair, weathered hands, reading glasses hanging on a chain around his neck. He wore the same blue work shirt every day, had coffee at Mabel's every morning at 7:30, and never talked about his past beyond saying he was formerly military. The townspeople loved him. He was reliable, honest, and could fix anything with a lock or key. Lost your house keys? Frank would make you a new set in 10 minutes. Locked out of your car? He'd be there in 15 minutes with a smile and no judgment. Ancient safe won't open. Frank somehow always knew exactly what to do. What they didn't know was that Frank's expertise went far beyond simple locks and keys. It was a Tuesday morning in October when the black SUV with Illinois plates pulled into town. Inside were 4 men who looked nothing like the usual visitors to Cedar Falls. They were younger, harder, and carried themselves with the swagger of people who thought they were smarter than everyone around them. The leader was Marcus Reed, 34, a career criminal with 3 previous heist convictions. He had spent months planning what he called the easiest score of his life. Cedar Falls' First National Bank was old, its security systems were outdated, and the local police force consisted of exactly 6 officers. Look at this place, Marcus said to his crew as they drove down Main Street. It's like stepping back in time. These people probably still leave their doors unlocked. His demolitions expert, Tommy Chen, nodded toward Frank's shop. Check out the old locksmith. Bet he's been using the same techniques since 1950. They parked across from the bank and began their surveillance. For 3 days, they watched patterns, timed the guards, and studied the building's layout. The vault was their target, a 1970s Mosler model that Marcus was confident they could crack with the right explosives. What they didn't realize was that Frank Miller was watching them too. From his position behind the shop counter, Frank had a perfect view of Main Street. After 20 years of military intelligence training, he noticed things others missed. The way the men in the SUV positioned themselves, how they never all left the vehicle at once, the fact that they were taking photos of the bank but trying to look casual about it. On the second day, one of them came into his shop. "Hey there," the man said, trying to sound friendly. "Nice little town you got here." "Thanks," Frank replied, not looking up from the lock he was repairing. "Visiting family?" "Yeah, something like that. Say, that bank across the street, it's been here a long time, hasn't it?" Frank's hands never stopped working, but his attention sharpened. "Since 1962. Why do you ask?" Just curious. Beautiful old building. They probably don't make security systems like they used to, huh? Now Frank looked up. The man was trying too hard to sound casual, and he kept glancing toward the bank. Actually, they upgraded the security about 5 years ago. State-of-the-art system now. It was a lie, but Frank wanted to see the man's reaction. The slight tightening around his eyes told Frank everything he needed to know. After the man left, Frank made a phone call to his old friend, Sheriff Bill Martinez. "Bill, we might have a problem," Frank said when the sheriff arrived at his shop that evening. Sheriff Martinez had known Frank for 15 years and had learned to trust his instincts. "What kind of problem?" "4 men in a black SUV with Illinois plates. They've been watching the bank for 3 days. One of them came in asking questions about the security system." "You think they're planning something?" Frank nodded. "Professional surveillance pattern. They're casing the place for a heist." "Should I arrest them?" "Can't arrest people for looking at a bank." "Not yet, but I think I know what they're planning." Frank pulled out a notebook where he'd been sketching. "See how they always park at the same angle? They're studying the vault wall. My guess is they're planning to blow through from the alley side." Sheriff Martinez looked skeptical. "Frank, how could you possibly know that?" For the first time in years, Frank's cover was about to slip. "Because that's exactly how I would do it." Sheriff Martinez stared at Frank. "What do you mean, how you would do it?" Frank was quiet for a long moment. He'd kept his military service vague for so many years that even his closest friends didn't know the details. But now, with the safety of his adopted town at stake, the truth was necessary. "Bill, when I said I was formerly military, I didn't tell you everything. I was Army EOD, Explosive Ordnance Disposal. For 20 years, I defused bombs, studied explosive devices, and yes, I designed security systems." The sheriff's jaw dropped. "You were a bomb disposal expert?" "Among other things. I also consulted on bank security systems for the military and worked with the FBI on several cases involving explosive-based heists." "Jesus, Frank, why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I came here to get away from all that. I wanted to fix locks and keys, not think about bombs and threats." Frank looked across at the bank. "But sometimes the past catches up with you." Sheriff Martinez was still processing this information. "So you really think they're going to try to blow up the vault?" "I'm certain of it, and I know exactly how they're planning to do it." That night, Frank did something he hadn't done in 25 years. He prepared for combat. In the basement of his shop, behind a false wall he'd built when he first moved to town, Frank kept certain items from his military days. Not weapons, those he'd left behind, but diagnostic equipment, technical manuals, and the kind of tools that only someone with his background would know how to use. He called Sheriff Martinez. "Bill, I need you to evacuate the buildings on either side of the bank tomorrow morning. Tell them it's a gas leak inspection or something." "Frank, maybe we should call the FBI. By the time they get here and set up, it'll be too late. These guys are going to move soon. I can feel it." "How can you be so sure?" "Because they are getting impatient. Today was the 4th day of surveillance. In my experience, amateur crews don't wait longer than 5 days. They get nervous and make mistakes." Frank was right. At 2 a.m. that night, the heist crew moved into position. Marcus Reed was confident as his team approached the bank through the alley. They had studied every angle, timed every patrol, and prepared for every contingency. The plan was simple. Blow through the back wall directly into the vault, grab the cash, and be gone in under 10 minutes. Tommy Chen, their explosives expert, had prepared shaped charges designed to punch through the vault wall without bringing down the building. It was sophisticated work, the kind that took real expertise. What they didn't know was that Frank Miller was already waiting for them. Frank had spent the evening studying the bank's blueprints, which he'd helped update 5 years earlier during the security renovation, and had positioned himself in the basement of the adjacent building. He had also made some modifications to their carefully planned operation. As Tommy began setting up his charges, Frank triggered a device he'd hidden earlier, a small electromagnetic pulse generator that interfered with electronic detonators. "Something's wrong," Tommy whispered to Marcus. "The charges aren't responding." "Fix it," Marcus hissed back, but Tommy couldn't fix it because he didn't understand what was happening. Frank Miller, however, understood exactly what was happening. He had designed the countermeasure himself. While Tommy struggled with his malfunctioning equipment, Frank made his move. He emerged from the shadows of the alley, carrying something the criminals didn't recognize, a military-grade signal jammer and a device that looked like it belonged in a bomb disposal unit. "Gentlemen," Frank said calmly, "I think you're having some technical difficulties." Marcus spun around, gun in hand. "Who the hell are you?" "Frank Miller. I'm the locksmith from across the street." "The locksmith?" Marcus laughed. "Old man, you picked the wrong night for a walk. Get out of here before you get hurt." Frank didn't move. "Actually, I think you're the ones who are going to get hurt. You see, those charges you're trying to detonate, they're not going to work." Tommy looked up from his equipment, confused. "What did you do?" "I introduced an electromagnetic interference pattern specifically designed to disrupt the frequency your detonators use. It's a technique I developed during my time with Army EOD." The confidence drained from Marcus's face. "Army what?" "Explosive Ordnance Disposal. 20 years of diffusing bombs, studying explosive devices, and, most relevant to your current situation, designing security systems that are impossible to bypass." Frank held up a small device. "This is a remote trigger I installed in your charges about an hour ago. Right now, those shaped charges are aimed away from the vault and toward the empty lot behind us. If you move another step toward that bank, I'll detonate them myself." Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You're bluffing. You're just some small-town locksmith." Frank's expression didn't change. Marcus Reed, born in Chicago, 3 previous convictions for armed robbery, currently wanted in Illinois for a casino heist. Tommy Chen, demolitions expert, trained in the Army but dishonorably discharged for selling equipment to civilian contractors. The men stared at him in shock. "How do you know that?" Marcus demanded. "Because when you've worked in military intelligence as long as I have, you learn to research your threats. I've known who you were since the first day you arrived in town." Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. "Sheriff Martinez, this is Frank. You can move in now." Within minutes, the alley was flooded with police cars, but not just from Cedar Falls. Frank had also called in favors from federal contacts, and FBI agents were among those making the arrests. As Marcus was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at Frank. "Who are you really?" Frank adjusted his reading glasses and smiled. "I'm exactly who I said I was. Frank Miller, locksmith. I just didn't mention that I used to be Sergeant Major Frank Miller, Army EOD, specializing in explosive device countermeasures and high-security installations." The next morning, word of the attempted bank robbery had spread throughout Cedar Falls. More interesting to the townspeople was the revelation about Frank Miller's background. "Frank was a bomb disposal expert?" Mabel asked at the diner, where half the town had gathered for coffee and gossip. 20 years in the Army," Sheriff Martinez confirmed. "Saved lives all over the world, and now he's saved our bank." Frank himself was trying to avoid the attention. He opened his shop at the usual time and went about his normal routine. But customers kept dropping by, not because they needed locks repaired, but because they wanted to thank him. Mrs. Henderson, the bank teller, was one of the first. "Frank, I don't know how to thank you. If those men had succeeded—" "Mrs. Henderson, nothing happened. Just another quiet day in Cedar Falls. But you risked your life to protect us." Frank looked up from the lock he was working on. "Ma'am, protecting people is what I've always done. The job may have changed, but the mission is the same." By afternoon, reporters from Des Moines and even Chicago had arrived in Cedar Falls. The story of the small-town locksmith who foiled a sophisticated bank heist was exactly the kind of human interest story that captured national attention. Frank refused all interview requests. "Mr. Miller," one persistent reporter called through his shop door, "people want to know about your military service. You're a hero." Frank sighed and walked to the door. "I'm not a hero. I'm a locksmith who happened to have some relevant experience. The real heroes are the sheriff and his deputies who made the arrests." "But your background in bomb disposal is exactly that. Background. What matters is that the bank is safe, the town is safe, and we can all go back to our normal lives." He closed the door and flipped the sign to "Closed for lunch." Despite Frank's attempts to downplay his role, the community of Cedar Falls wasn't going to let his heroism go unrecognized. The town council organized a small ceremony at the bank, and the mayor presented Frank with a key to the city. "Frank Miller has been a valued member of our community for 25 years, Mayor Patricia Walsh said. "What we learned yesterday is that he's been protecting us in ways we never knew. Frank accepted the honor graciously but briefly. Thank you, but I didn't do this for recognition. I did it because Cedar Falls is my home, and you protect your home. The crowd applauded, but Frank was already thinking about getting back to his shop. He had 3 lock repairs waiting and Mrs. Johnson's car keys to duplicate. Within a week, the reporters had left and Cedar Falls had settled back into its normal rhythm. Frank returned to his routine of coffee at Mabel's, working in his shop and helping neighbors with their lock and key problems. But something had changed. The community's respect for Frank had deepened, not just because of what he had done, but because of how he had done it, quietly, competently, without seeking credit or glory. Young people in town began stopping by his shop more often, not always because they needed keys made, but because they were curious about his stories. Frank was careful not to glorify war or violence, but he did share lessons about service, responsibility, and the importance of using your skills to help others. "Mr. Miller," asked Sarah, a high school senior, "do you miss being in the Army?" Frank considered the question while cutting a new key. "I miss the sense of purpose, the feeling that what you do matters. But I found that same sense of purpose here, just in a different way." "How?" "Every lock I fix, every key I make, every problem I solve, it's still about helping people feel secure and safe. The scale is smaller, but the mission is the same." Late one evening, after closing his shop, Frank sat in his back room looking at the key to the city the mayor had given him. It was a beautiful piece, ornately designed and perfectly crafted. He thought about the path that had brought him here, from a young man joining the Army to the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan to the quiet streets of Cedar Falls. Every stage had taught him something different about service, about community, about what it means to protect something valuable. The bank heist had reminded him that skills never really fade. They just wait for the right moment to be useful again. But more than that, it had shown him that he had found exactly where he belonged. Frank picked up the phone and called his daughter in California, something he did every Sunday but felt compelled to do tonight. "Hi, Dad," she answered. "I saw the news story about you online. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, honey. Just wanted to hear your voice." "Dad, I'm so proud of you. But I have to ask, why didn't you ever tell me about all the things you did in the Army?" Frank smiled. "Because being your father was always more important than anything I did as a soldier, and being part of this community is more important than anything I did yesterday." Frank Miller still opens his shop every morning at 8 a.m. He still has coffee at Mabel's, still fixes locks and makes keys, and still deflects any attempt to treat him as anything other than the town locksmith. But now, when visitors come to Cedar Falls and ask about local attractions, longtime residents often point them toward Miller's Lock and Key. "See that little shop?" they'll say. "That's Frank Miller's place. He's been taking care of our security for 25 years now." They don't always mention the bank robbery, because that's not really the point. The point is that Frank Miller represents something that small towns treasure most: the quiet guardian, the person who watches over the community, not because it's his job, but because it's his calling. And if you stop by his shop and look carefully, you might notice that behind the counter, next to his coffee cup and reading glasses, Frank keeps a small photo. It shows a group of soldiers in desert camouflage, young men and women who trusted him to keep them safe. Next to it is a newer photo, the Cedar Falls High School graduation class of 2023, including young Sarah, who used to stop by with questions about his Army days. Different faces, different times, but the same mission: taking care of the people who matter to you. Some protectors wear uniforms and carry weapons. Others wear blue work shirts and carry key-cutting machines. Both are essential. Both are honored. And in Cedar Falls, Iowa, Frank Miller continues to do what he's always done, making sure people feel safe when they lock their doors at night. Sometimes the most extraordinary people really do hide in the most ordinary places. Sometimes the person who can defuse a bomb spends his days making house keys. Sometimes the quiet guy who's been part of your community for decades is actually the guardian you never knew you needed. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe stories like Frank's deserve to be told, subscribe to Echo Stories. We're here to remind you that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear reading glasses and keep shop hours from 8 to 5. We'll see you in the next story.